Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. 2093 AC. Jaime looked out on the walls of Castamere. In 2 years, they'd transformed the place. The castle was still more rundown than it should be, but they'd created a large living quarters in one of the main parts of the keep, and while the rest still needed work, he could now bring Joy here and have somewhere comfortable for her to stay. Originally, he was going to ignore the castle itself. Building a new one would take more time, perhaps, but it would allow it to be planned out to his own preferences. But the more he walked around the ruins of Castamere, the more he saw its potential. When finished, it would be an imposing seat, and even if he didn't see the benefit of it for a long time, he wasn't building it for himself. "My lord, a raven for you," Maston the squire said as he handed him the scroll. "Thanks, lad. Why don't you go get the horses ready? We'll take a ride over to the mines and have luncheon over there today." He smiled at the young lad. "Of course, my lord. I'll see to it at once." When the boy left, Tyrion looked at the raven and shrugged. He broke the seal with no reverence whatsoever. The crowned stag just annoying him, and began to read to see what message the king was sending now. Ever since he'd been named as Lord of Castamere, he'd occasionally receive a raven from the crown, asking him to come to some feast or other at King's Landing. Luckily, being so busy allowed him to ignore them. "Lord Jeru, His Grace invites you to the tourney of King's Landing in recognition of the 10-year anniversary of His Grace's victory over the dragons. We shall be pleased to accept you and your retinue, and His Grace's bids you to come and enjoy the festivities. Jon Arryn, Hand of the King." Jerian scrunched the scroll up and threw it off the battlements, smiling as he saw it blow away in the air. He had no intention of going to King's Landing any time in the near future, and certainly not at the request of a drunken king celebrating a 10-year-old war. He made his way down to the courtyard to find Maston standing by his horse with his guards smiling at them. He quickly mounted, and they rode out of the gates towards the mines themselves. The ride to the mines didn't take very long, and when he saw them come into view, he once again marveled at what they'd accomplished here. 2 years ago, this had been abandoned, and now it was a hive of activity. The barracks they had built housed almost 1,000 men, with 200 of them mounted. To get to the mines you would need to take the barracks, and where they'd placed it made it very unlikely you could. There was narrow valley leading to the mine entrance, and Jerion had copied the design of the Bloody Gate of the Vale for his defensive position. The walls of the barracks were hard stone, and placed on top of them were a number of large scorpions which could be fired at any attacking force. Behind the walls they had a number of large trebuchets, and with the mines themselves behind them had more than enough stone to fling at any enemy. One of the more curious things they had was a large multi-arrowed crossbow, which was attached to a bellows, and when needed the wind wheels. Jerion still wasn't sure how it worked. Only that it could fire crossbow bolts the size of spears rapidly and continuously for as long as the bellows was connected to the wind wheel. "My lord," Karen said as he reached the barracks gate. "Good day, Caron. How fares you?" "I'm well, my lord. We didn't expect you today," the tall blonde man said worriedly. "Don't worry, my friend. It's just a passing fancy. Nothing else. Davin abouts." Jerion smiled reassuringly at the man. "Aye, my lord. He's around. I think he's in his office. Shall I send for him?" "No need. Just let him know I passed through. I'll speak with him on my return." Davin had been appointed as head of the mine forces by Jerion not long after his return from King's Landing. The boy had changed drastically. Where once he was fun-loving, he had come back serious, and Jerion knew the reason why. He had never spoken of it to him, and when he'd offered him the chance to be captain of his guards, Davin had jumped at it. His father had been pleased to see his boy given such a responsibility, and Jerion had no doubts of the boy's suitability for the post. They rode past the lake on their way to the mines themselves. The village that had started as just a place for the mine workers to sleep in had developed in 2 years into a small town. It had stores and a couple of taverns, a small sept, and even an area where the children could play freely. The town even had a rather large brothel, which probably did better business than the one in Lannisport. Truth be told, even though the workers were well paid, Jerion had insisted that food and supplies for their families would be given to them at cost. The tavern was owned by him, and the brothel, though not something he cared much about, was clean, and the girls treated well. For a man who never sought responsibility, he found he had enjoyed it more than he thought, and it was freeing to have so many people relying on him. "All right, lads, here will do," Jerion said as he dismounted his horse and walked the rest of the way. You want us to go with you, my lord? Maston asked. No, lad. Have the boys set up. We'll have lunch in here. I'll just have a word with Dax and see how things are. Every time he walked into the mines, he always felt the same. What they'd done here was incredible. The veins they'd found were more than they could ever imagine, and with the addition of the wind wheels allowing for the tunnels to be both aired out and for the tools to work in conjunction with them, it allowed them to dig deeper and more quickly than they'd ever thought possible. "Milord," Dax said as he saw him walk towards him. "Dax, how fares you?" "I as well, milord. You needs anything?" "No, just thought I'd have a look round. See how things were?" "They's good, milord. Found a new one t'other day, a large one. Keep us busy for moons, methinks." "Very good. How about you and the lads? You have everything you need?" "Aye, we's fine, milord. Thanks for asking. The lads are doing well." "Well, don't let me keep you, Dax. Don't work the lads too hard, all right." He smiled as the other man laughed at him. "No's fear of the milord. You won't let us." Jaime nodded and walked back to the entrance. He'd speak to Davin on his way back to the castle if he had nothing for him to worry about. He'd think about heading back to Casterly Rock for a while. He missed everyone there and hadn't seen Joy in a couple of moons. His girl was growing fast, and a part of him wondered if he should move her to Castamere, or was it too soon. "Janna!" Jaina smiled as her two boys swung their swords. Tachin had improved incredibly well, and Walder, while not the strongest, had taken on some of the lessons he'd learned with Jon and was using his movements and quickness to frustrate his older brother. Off to the left, Martin and Willem watched intently, no doubt keen to face the winner, while Loras looked on a little bored. She watched as Jon stared intently at her boys. Over the years, she'd become very fond of the young lad. He'd won her over like he seemed to do with most people who spent time in his company. When she had seen how he interacted with her niece, she had begun to realize what Tyrion had said about the boy was right. He didn't do things for favor, he just did things because they were the right things to do. It had hurt a little to see his expression when she had started Joy on her lessons and began to spend more time with the little girl, but he had quickly seen the benefits, and while his attention to her had started to bring her out of her shell, she needed to learn what it was to be a lady, and Jon couldn't teach her that. "Wait, Tion!" Walder stopped. Jon said loudly, forcing her to look and pay more attention to the yard. "What do you think you're doing? Your brothers don't act that way," she heard him chastise her sons. She wondered what had happened. She'd been distracted just for a moment, and obviously something had occurred. She turned to Alizia, who was standing with Joy to her left. "What happened?" Walder spun and landed a hit on Tachan, and he got angry. My lady began to swing his sword, not to spar, but to hurt Walder, Alizia said, and Jenna grew angry. She was about to go down to give him a piece of his mind when she heard Joy laughing. "Teachin's in trouble," the little girl said, and she looked down to see Teachin looking nervously while standing facing Jon, who had his sword out. She couldn't help but smirk. Jon had a way of punishing her boys when they stepped out of line that worked better than any she had come up with. They idolized him a little. She knew that they mimicked him, and his lessons with them were the ones they really looked forward to, so when they disappointed him, they felt it more keenly. "Ready, Jon?" "I'm sorry, Jon. I lost my temper. I'll apologize to Walder. It won't happen again." "Fine, go say sorry to your brother. Then you and Walder switch and take on Martin and Willem," Jon said as her son turned to head towards his brother. "And Taxion, remember they're your family too. Keep it friendly." "I will. Sorry, Jon." She nodded down at the boy when he looked towards her, and Joy and Alesia headed back inside her. She had work to do, and Joy had her embroidery, much to the little girl's annoyance, as she repeatedly made clear, "No, Auntie, don't like it," Joy said when she realized where they were heading. "Joy, you must take your lessons. When they're finished, I'll allow you to ride apples." "With Jon and Ghost," the girl said excitedly. "I'm sure Jon will join you." "All right, Auntie," Joy said, and she gave the little girl a kiss before Alzia took her to her lesson. Joy, just like her boys, was easy to get to do what you wished her to. Just like them promise her some time with Jon, and she'd come around. Since he'd bought apples for her, even more so, the girl loved the small little pony, and despite Gurne's fears of allowing her to ride at her age, Jon had assured her the girl was ready. Seeing her on the horse was an incredible sight, just like Jon. She seemed born for horse riding, and even though she'd occasionally have Jenna's heart racing with how fast she rode, she had never had an accident or even come close to falling off. Jenna walked down to her nephew's office. If only these two boys were as easy to manage, she sighed. Despite her best efforts, she had found, much to her dismay, that marrying off either of her reticent nephews was a challenge too far. Georgina had shown no interest whatsoever in following through on any of the ladies she'd tried to set him up with. He'd met them and been charming and simply gone through the motions. Tyrion was another matter altogether, and it pained her that her nephew had been right. No lord would agree to marry one of their daughters to a dwarf. She knocked on the door and entered, finding her two nephews laughing and joking in a manner not befitting the lords of Casterly Rock, and she couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. The two men had become closer than ever in the last few years, true brothers, and along with herself and her own two brothers, the family was more united than it had ever been under Tywin. "Aunt, what brings you to our domain?" Tyrion japed. "Domain, nephew, really?" she said, raising her eyebrow. "Aye, impressive, is it not?" Tyrion said, waving his hand over the desk. "Yes, more than impressive," she said dismissively before taking her seat. "Anyway, I'm here on important business." Jaina looked from one to the other. "I want us to go to the tourney in King's Landing." "Why would we do that?" Jaime asked. "I think it's about time we made our presence felt in the realm, and I'm sure both your squires would no doubt like to test the jousting skills that they work so much on." She watched as Jaime considered it for a moment. He looked at Tyrion, who just shrugged. She knew the idea of a visit to King's Landing was nothing he would be interested in. No matter how many times she'd suggested it or how many ravens he received from his sister, he wouldn't leave the Rock to go there, and had only traveled through the West in the last 4 years. "Fine, I'll consider it. Aunt, who would go?" Jaime asked, and she breathed a sigh of relief. "I think we all should." "Even me?" Tyrion asked, his voice a little eager. "Yes, nephew, even you, Sir Adam, can step in as Castellan while we're away, and Jurian would place Davin in charge of Castamere. Cavan would no doubt allow Harris to take over his duties," Geddon said. "What of the children?" Jaime asked. "We can take them with us. Surely there's enough room on those monstrosities you've built." "You mean for us to sail?" Tyrion asked. "It would be quicker and more comfortable," Jaime said. "Very well, Aunt, I'll give you an answer later, for certain. But I think it's a good idea," Jaime said. "Good, now would you two actually do some work?" "No," they both said together, making them all laugh. She shook her head and got up to leave. It had been years since she'd been in King's Landing, and the idea had just hit her. She knew her sons would love to see a tourney, and despite not wishing to travel on those huge ships that Tyrion had Cavan build, she knew from what Cavan had told her how fast they sailed. A moon's-long journey by land could be done in a couple of sennights. Now what Lees would be at this tourney, she wondered. Jon, riding Winter was still an absolute pleasure to him, no matter how many times he did it, whether it was fun for travel or riding in the jousting practices against Loras. He could never tire of the feeling of being on board his mare. In the last few years, he had been given the added bonus of Ghost growing large enough to run beside them, and though Winter was faster than any other horse he'd seen thus far, Ghost could manage to keep up with them. As for the White Wolf, well, he was incredible. He had outgrown most hounds and dogs over a year ago, and when he reached the size of a full-grown wolf, Jon had assumed that would be it. But the wolf had just kept growing. He was almost the size of a small horse, and when Joy rode Apples, if she wished, she wouldn't need to bend down to pat Ghost's head if he was beside her, which right now he was. "Ghost faster," the little girl laughed as she and Apples sped up, the wolf running close beside them. "Careful, Joy," he shouted after her. "Come, Jon, faster. Catch me," she shrieked as she pushed on. He heard Aelir's and Jor's laugh behind him while Lors snorted. He kicked Winter into gear and raced after the excitable little girl. Catching up to her a few moments later, he couldn't help but smile at the look on her face. They slowed down near some trees and a small stream and waited for the others to catch up. After he dismounted and carefully took Joy off Apples, he allowed Jars to lead the horse to get something to drink, and took his pack off Winter to make sure Joy had her midday meal. Getting the girl to eat without others around had always seemed to be harder to Jon. If she saw you eat, though, then suddenly she was hungry. "Come on, Joy. Time for pie," he said, and watched as the girl looked to the spread he was laying out. "No, Jon, you no pie," the girl said, shaking her head. Jon took out the peach pie that he'd had made earlier and watched her eyes light up. He placed it close beside him and took some meat and cooked vegetables and placed them on a plate for Joy to eat. "No, Jon pie," the girl said, crossing her arms together and shaking her head. "Joy, you need to eat some of this first, then I'll give you some pie. I promise." "Promise?" "Aye, princess. I promise." He smiled as Joy began to eat the meat and vegetables. He laid out some more for Axe and Jers and for Franklin and Garth, who were Loris's guards, Loris having already helped himself as soon as he sat down. When Joy was finished eating, he poured her some milk into a cup and watched as she drank it quickly, before belching loudly, much to his and everyone's amusement. "Pie, Jon?" Joy said determinedly. "All right, princess," he said as he handed her a piece which she wolfed down, covering herself in pie crumbs and bits of peach. "Joy made mess," she said, and laughed. He reached over to grab something to clean the girl, only for a flash of white to dart past his eye. "No go, stop," he heard her say while she laughed loudly. The white wolf licking the peach and crumbs from her face and clothes. "That's one way to keep her clean." Lorziak. He just shook his head and whooshed the wolf away. Ghost looked at him and cocked his head before something grabbed his attention, and before Jon knew it, the wolf was on the rest of the pie. Joy just kept laughing, and Jon was forced to join her when he tried to discipline the wolf. "Bad Ghost," he said as he reached over. Only for Ghost to look at him with a look that Jon swore said, "I'm not sorry at all." "You did bring 2 of those, right?" Lors asked, giggling. "I didn't think I'd need one this quick, though." They sat around by the trees for a little while, Joy content to chase Ghost and try to grab him, and the wolf always seeming to be close enough for her to try, but not close enough for her to succeed. Eventually they mounted back up and headed back to the rock. Jon could see Joy was starting to feel a bit tired, so they stopped, and he nodded to Elias to take apples while he placed her in front of him on Winter, and raced home, much to her delight. The rest of the day passed by quickly. Once they arrived back at the rock, he and Loras headed to their lessons and, when finished, had their own spar, the one earlier having been spent mainly teaching the younger boys. Loras had improved since he'd arrived 2 years ago. After he realized he couldn't beat Jon, he'd asked for advice, and both he and Jaime had been keen to give him some. Now, though, he still wasn't as good as him. Jon felt there were not many better than him around. He had read Joy her story and bid Loras good night and made his way his rooms earlier than normal that night, feeling a little bit more tired than usual. Ghost hadn't returned from his hunt, having taken to prowling in the nearby woods most evenings, before sloping in when he felt like it. So Jon curled up in his bed and was asleep not long after his head hit the pillow. The woods were dark, and the sounds were louder than they should be, but he silently moved towards his prey. His eyes could see every single detail, every mark, every trail was to him as clear as the roads on a map. He heard the hooting of the owl louder and more intense than he knew it should be. The snapping of a branch was like the slamming of a door, loud and obtrusive, yet he made not a sound. As he made it to the clearance, he saw it. The small deer, unaware of his presence, he moved swifter than anything of his size had the right to, and within seconds was upon his prey. The deer struggled, but it was over in minutes. The warmth of the blood pooling in his mouth. Jon woke up with a start, the taste in his mouth coppery and fluid. He leaned over and quickly washed it away with the water in the jug on his small table. He looked down to see Ghost laying on the floor asleep, the wolf's fur streaked with red. The dreams had been happening more and more regularly, and he had tried to find anything about them in the books in the library, but so far had not been lucky. Sometimes he'd dream of different things, of a tower in the desert, of a woman crying, a man on a horse wearing black armor, or a straggly-haired man shouting, "Burn them all." In some, he'd see faces or shapes, and others only voices. "Promise me," and "Ice and Fire," the 2 he heard most often. He worried he was going mad, as occasionally he'd see things that weren't there, and drift off when doing something, only to come back with ideas he knew not from whence they came. He got up and dressed himself, and found Ghost had woken, so took him to the baths to be washed, whatever these dreams were about. He'd worry on them later. He had work to do, and it was time to meet up with Jaime for his morning spar. Lozira. The last 2 years had been some of the best of his life. Learning from Jaime had improved him no end, and sparring daily with both him and Jon had allowed him to refine his swordsmanship. He'd had time to work out the errors he had, and especially with Jon's help, see the flaws he continually fell prey to. Jon was a far better swordsman than he. He could see that now, and he was grateful that he got to spar with him. When they faced off against each other with normal sparring swords, he stood a chance. He'd get some hits in and would come close occasionally to winning, but when Jon used this small thin sword, he was far too good for him. Loras had tried it himself, but it didn't seem to have the same effect on him that it did on Jon. With it, Loras was clumsy and awkward, while Jon was like an artist with it in his hands, his movements much too fast for Loras to counter. Thankfully, when they jousted, things were much more even. Jon was a better horseman. But Loras wielded the lance better. They shared wins there, and it did a lot for Loras's confidence to find that he was equal to his friend in some disciplines. Over the 2 years that he'd been here, they'd become the closest of friends. He felt he could tell Jon anything, and the two boys always seemed able to cheer the other up when they felt a bit down. He couldn't thank his grandmother enough for sending him here. "Lora's grandmother wishes to see you," Margaery said. "What about Marge?" "I think she wants to discuss your squiring." "So, who in King's Landing am I to squire for?" "Not King's Landing, Casterly Rock, Loras. Grandmother intends for you to squire for Lord Jaime." "But Jon's Lord Jaime's squire, is he all right? Has something happened?" "No, he's fine. I think grandmother intends for you to squire with Jon." Lorzier looked at her confusedly. 2 squires wasn't unheard of, but he hadn't heard Lord Jaime was looking for another one. He'd jump at the chance to do so, though. To learn from Jaime Lannister would be incredible. And to squire alongside Jon, they got on well together. They'd surely be friends. He followed Margaery down to the garden to where their grandmother was speaking to his father. He could hear his grandmother's angry voice, and when they arrived, had been told it was decided. Within 2 moons, he had been standing in the courtyard of Casterly Rock, and was welcomed by both Jaime and Jon. From the very first day, he'd known this was the best thing that had happened to him. He and Jon just naturally got on. There was no pretense, no having to be a Tyrell. Here he was. Loras and Jon was Jon. Loras made his way to break his fast. They had received the news that they would all be going to King's Landing for the King's tourney in a couple of moons' time, and he was excited both for himself and his friend Jon, having missed the last tourney in Highgarden due to an illness. He loved competing in the events, had even rode against a knight last time, and was unlucky to fall. While his father hadn't had a squire's duel, much to his annoyance, the king would certainly have one, and he looked forward to facing Jon in competition. "Morning, my lord," Elizia said to him, the pretty girl blushing as he smiled at her. "Morning, Alizier. I see Jon and Joy are up early again," he said, pointing to the table where they were both eating and feeding Ghost. "They are my lord. Can I get you anything?" Alicia said, "No, it's fine. I'll grab something myself. You go enjoy your own meal." He smiled at the girl and grabbed a plate, watching as the White Wolf stared at the extra bacon he placed on it. He walked to the table and sat down, nodding to Jon, who was engaged in trying to keep his last sausage from Joy's grasping hand. The little girl, no doubt, eager to feed the wolf some more. "Jon, give me. Ghost is hungry," Joy said. "Ghost has had enough, haven't you, boy?" Jon asked the wolf, who shook his head, making Loras snort. "Oh, look, Joy, Loras has lots of food for Ghost," Jon said, smirking at him before moving Joy closer to his plate. Loras shook his head before smiling. He had brought extra bacon, and even if he hadn't, the little girl's pleading look was always too hard to resist. He watched as she grabbed a slice of bacon and dropped it into Ghost's waiting mouth. "Say thank you to Loras, Joy." "Thanks you, Loras," she smiled before grabbing some more. He broke their fast in that fashion for a while, Jon eventually grabbing Joy to bring her to her lesson while Loras went down to organize his horse for their jousting practice. They had decided to get some practice in on both the joust and spar, and would do an hour of riding against each other, just hitting the shields without trying to knock each other from the horses. Before a good hour of full-on sparring, their other lessons would be later this morn. He sat on his horse and lined up for the tilt, Jon already positioned at the other end. After a moment they set off, and when they met in the middle, he aimed his lance at Jon's shield, annoyed to find that he'd missed. Jon's strike catching him square, he turned and rode back to start again, and yet again he missed his strike, while Jon landed his. All in all, they rode against each other 7 times, and he managed just 1 hit, while Jon landed all his. By the time they had put the horse away and got ready for their spar, Loras was in a bad mood. He knew during the sparring he would lose when he saw Jon take his thin sword, and after the jousting, he was feeling frustrated. The sparring went exactly how he thought it would, Jon showing just how much quicker and cleaner his strikes were with the small sword. "Better luck next time, Loras," Jon said with a smile. "You just had an off day today." "Let's do one more," Loras asked, determined to beat his friend. "I don't think so." "Loras, let's leave it until tomorrow," I said. "I want to do another one." "What's wrong? Bastard, scared. I'll beat you." As soon as the words left his mouth, he realized what he'd said. He had never spoken like that to Jon before, never even considered him a bastard. "Jon, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it," he said apologetically. But he could see that Jon was in no humor to accept his apology. He watched as Jon walked away. Sure, he'd seen tears in the other boy's eyes, and for the first time ever he felt ashamed of himself. He tried to follow after him, but Ghost suddenly appeared and snarled silently at him. The wolf's teeth were exposed, scaring Loras into staying where he was. After a moment, the wolf ran after Jon, but not before turning his head to look at Loras, almost as if to warn him not to follow them. Jacking. Jon hadn't turned up for training the last 2 mornings, complaining of feeling ill. Jaime had asked Crelin to check on him and found to his consternation that the maester could find nothing wrong with him, and that perhaps Jon was just tired. Even when Joy visited him, Jon seemed to go through the motions according to Janna and only seemed to be pretending to be happy for the girl's sake. Jaime had spoken to Tyrion to see if anything had happened, but it was when he spoke to Loras that he found out the reason behind Jon's sudden reluctance to take part in things. The boy wasn't sick, he was upset, and Jaime's first instinct when he heard Loras explain what had happened had been to pack the boy back off to Highgarden. "You said what?" "I'm sorry, my lord. I don't know why I said it. It just came out." "Oh, it just came out, did it? You called your friend a bastard because he beat you, and now you claim it just came out." "My lord, I didn't mean it. I swear it. I never thought of Jon like that. I was just mad at being beaten, and I didn't think—" "You're damn right you didn't. You hurt your friend because you were jealous, damn it, Loras. Just go to your room. I'll deal with you later." "But if I could just talk to him." "Talk, after what you said. I think talking is the last thing I'll allow you to do." Jaime knew he'd been cruel to the boy, but he also knew how Jon would feel. It was bad enough for someone else to think of him like that. Jaime and his family had managed to make him, if not care, then at least ignore those who thought him a bastard. Between their words and acts and Jon's own achievements, in the West at least, most people saw Jon as what he was, a very special young man. But when it came from those Jon cared about, when it was related to those he loved, then nothing anyone could say to the boy made him feel better. After their trip to the wedding in Old Town, Jaime had put it off. He had comforted the boy as well as he could, without telling him the truth. He used the excuse of making them more ready, of ensuring as much as he could that should the worst happen, he could protect Jon. With the additional income from Castamere, they'd begun building the fleet, while not fully ready. It would take many years for that. The fleet he now had at his disposal, which was made up of purchased older ships, new ones built by both their own people and the Manderleys, and 4 of the new design Jon had come up with, was impressive. He knew they would be hard to beat, even if Robert managed to combine the entirety of the fleets in the realm. The army his father had built was still intact, and if anything, more ready than any other force in Westeros. He could probably, if need be, take the capital. Holding it would be a problem, but crowning Jon and beating Robert, then calling for a council, could perhaps work. It wouldn't be ideal, but it was possible. Of course, he'd prefer a lot more time, but it could be done. He sighed. He knew what he had to do. It was time to tell Jon the truth, and he hoped the boy would take it well. Jaime got up from his desk and walked to the false wall his father had built in the solar. He took out the chest and closed the door back up before calling to his guards to help him carry it to Jon's room. "Gareth, Jarvis, can you come in here for a moment, please?" he called out to the guards. "My lord, you need something?" Gareth asked. I need you to carry this to Jon's room and wait for me. I'll be there in a moment." "Very well, my lord," Gareth said as he and Jarvis picked the chest up and headed to Jon's room. He quickly filled a glass with wine and drank it down in one swallow, steadying himself. He left and walked to speak to Jon. When he got there, he knocked and found Jon laying in the bed awake, but facing the wall, Ghost curled up beside him. He motioned to his guards to bring in the box, and placed it down on the ground beside the bed. "That's fine, lads. I want you to call Lisa and Jers and place them on either end of the corridor. No one's allowed to come this way until I tell you otherwise. You two are to stand with them. Understood?" "Aye, my lord," Jarvis said confusedly. "That mean no one. No one at all. Not even Tyrion. You got that?" "Aye, my lord," Gareth said, and the 2 guards headed to fulfill their orders. When they were gone, he turned to see Jon, looking at him intently. "Jon, I need you to do something for me." "What, my lord?" Jon asked. "I need you to have Ghost guard the door. No one can come in, Jon. No one." "Why, my lord?" Jon looked at him worriedly. "I need you to trust me on this, Jon." Jon nodded and looked to the wolf, who immediately stood up. Every time he saw it, the wolf seemed bigger. Right now, it was up to Jaime's hip, and was far bigger than any wolf he'd ever seen. He watched on as Jon and the wolf had a silent conversation before Ghost moved towards the door. Their connection baffled him, but he got up and opened the door, and the wolf walked outside and took up position. Jaime locked the door and walked over to pull a chair and sit by the bed. "What's going on, my lord?" Jon asked, sitting up on the bed and facing him now. "I heard what happened with Loras." Jaime said, noticing the way Jon stiffened slightly. "It was nothing, my lord." "No, Jon, it wasn't. I know he hurt you." "He didn't mean to. I know that, but he hurt you all the same." It doesn't matter," Jon said, his lip shaking. "It does, Jon. It's my fault. I wanted to tell you earlier, but we had to be ready. I couldn't risk it." "Risk what, my lord?" "That the truth would get out. That people would know who you really are." He took a deep breath as Jon looked at him in confusion. It was now or never, he thought. "Jon, you're not a bastard," Jaime said to silence. "Your father is not Ned Stark." "What? You're lying? Of course he's my father. Why are you lying to me?" Jon said angrily. "Jon, please. I need you to listen. What I'm telling you is the truth. I swear it." No, it can't be. You're lying to me. I don't understand. Why would you? Jon said as the tears fell from his face. Jaime jumped from his seat and grabbed the boy. Jon struggled against him, but he held him tightly, his own eyes beginning to water. He felt him push against him, trying to break free, the sobs growing louder and louder. He heard the scratching at the door, knew Ghost was trying to get inside. Then he could hear the banging as the wolf beat against the door. "Jon, please. I can explain. You need to calm Ghost down," he said, as he looked at him. It took a few moments before finally the wolf at the door stopped. He could see the bellowing of it from where he sat on the bed beside Jon. Another few moments and the wolf would have broken it down, and he could only imagine what it looked like from outside. He got up from the bed and walked to the door, unlocking it before walking outside. As soon as he opened it, the wolf streaked past him into the room. Jaime looked down the corridor to see his two guards looking on concernedly. "It's all right, lads. Everything's fine," he said, trying to reassure them. "Are you sure, my lord?" Jarvis asked. "Aye, lads, I am." He turned back and walked into the room, locking the door behind him as he did so. There was no way he'd get Ghost to leave now, and he saw the wolf was laying on the bed beside Jon, looking at him warily. He moved over to the chair and sat back down. "Jon, I'm going to tell you the truth now, after you can ask me any questions you wish, all right?" "Are you my father?" Jon asked, looking him in the eye. "No, Jon, I'm not. But you're more a son to me than any I could ever have," Jaime said, smiling at the boy. Jon nodded, and Jaime reached over to grab the mug from the table. He filled one with water and handed it to Jon, who drank it down quickly. He refilled it and took the other one for himself, and got ready to tell his king the greatest secret in Westeros. Jon, ever since Jaime had spoken to him and showed him what was in the chest, Jon had been lost in a whirlwind of emotions. He was trueborn, his father and mother married, raised as a bastard to protect him from a wrathful king. All of it sounded like the stuff of the great tales he read in books. But his life was not a tale, and like with everything else, there were parts he couldn't grasp. Why would his uncle not tell him? Would he have ever told him the truth? Was he to have spent his whole life as a bastard? The questions rattled around in his head. Some he could answer. He was far too young for his uncle to tell him. For others, he just didn't know, and would need to speak to his uncle to be sure. What do I do now? What does this mean? Am I a king or a bastard? These questions were much harder to answer. He knew what Jaime wanted, and he had to admit he wanted it too. He knew Robert was not a good king, and Cersei was certainly a terrible queen. But his father and mother had started a war with their actions. His birth was only possible because so many gave their lives. Was he now to ask more to risk themselves, just so he could sit a throne? It is you, birthright. Your destiny. You are the prince that was promised. The song of ice and fire. He shook his head and tried to clear the voices. They had begun the moment he had touched the dragon egg that Shamir removed from the chest. As soon as he had touched it, he had begun to hear them, and one other that was constant and louder. "Wake me, wake me." He had placed the egg in the fire grate when Jaime had left, almost as if he wasn't in control of himself. He had walked over and put the egg down among the kindling before walking to his table and taking the small paring knife he kept there. Taking the knife, he had cut himself across his left palm and walked back to the egg, letting the blood drop against its white and blue jagged surface. He watched in awe as the blood disappeared, the egg seeming to swallow every drop. When he had finished, he picked up a piece of cloth and covered the small wound on his hand, and then walked back to the fire and set the kindling alight. He moved his chair and sat there for he knew not how long, just staring into the fire, adding more and more wood to ensure it did not go out. The voice still resonating in his head. "Wake me. Wake me?" After a while, he stalked a fire with as much wood as he could and climbed into his bed. Ghost was off hunting and wouldn't be back for a few more hours, so he turned and went to sleep, trying not to think too much of the events of the previous days. His sleep, as it had been for the last 2 nights, though, was fitful and full of dreams, the same one playing out over and over. The men stood facing each other beside a river, one of them huge and wearing an antler helm, the other more slight and wearing the most beautiful black armor adorned with rubies. The large man swung a massive warhammer, narrowly missing the other man, who stepped aside quickly. His sword glistened in the light, and he moved it quickly and precisely, forcing the other man to move backwards. On and on it went, the 2 men seemingly evenly matched, strength versus speed, power against precision. Finally, the man with the sword caught the other man in the shoulder, forcing the man to his knee. He took off his helm to reveal silver hair that shined as bright as the sun behind him. His eyes a deep indigo. He looked at the fallen man and sighed sadly. "Robert, it's over. Give up, cousin. Accept it. She never loved you. You know this to be true." "No, she was mine, and you stole her from me. Damn you. Dragon spawn. Damn you to all the hells." He watched as the man raised his sword. Could see the reticence in the act. But then the large man had something in his hand, and threw it at the other. Stones and dirt hit the other man in the face. He took a moment to recover, but by then it was over. The large man raised his hammer and swung with all his might, the rubies flying from the man's chest. He fell into the river. "Yana," he said, as his eyes closed. Jon woke with tears in his eyes, as he did each morning he'd had the dream. He looked to see Ghost looking at him with worry and tried to remember letting the wolf into the room. He shook his head as he couldn't and got up from the bed. The fire was almost out, and as he moved towards it, the voices began yet again. "Wake me, wake me." He reached over to the table and took the knife again. Removing the cloth from his hand, he cut along the still unhealed cut, and as the blood began to flow, he held his hand over the egg. When he was done, he put the last remaining pieces of wood on the fire and watched as it quickly caught. He quickly dressed and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found Allers outside. The man smiled at him nervously, so Jon gave him a full one back, seeming to reassure the man somewhat. "Allers, can you have someone bring me more wood for the fire?" Of course. "Are you feeling all right, Jon?" Allers asked, and Jon was heartened by the concern in his voice. "I'm good, thanks." He turned and walked back into the room. Walking to the chest, he opened it and looked inside. The sword was just as magnificent as he imagined it would be. He could see it clearly now. Jaime had made him train with the thin sword, while nowhere near Dark Sister. The thin sword he'd used did have the dimensions correct, and Jon knew just by looking at the Valyrian blade that wielding it would be a joy. The cloak was beautiful, the grey wolf incredibly intricate, and the pose it was captured in invoked in Jon a vision of a fierce she-wolf, ready to protect her pup. As he touched the material, he could feel the tears begin to fall. He pulled it close to him and held it tightly. His mother had worn this. It and Jon were all that remained to show she had lived, that she had existed. Everything else was just memories, and most of those were lies. He thought back to what Jaime had told him. It all began at the tourney of Harrenhal. I'm not certain of the why or how. I was not there during and only returned later. I know it had something to do with a bannerman of your grandfather's, a Lord Reed. But whatever it was, your mother took it upon herself to ride in the lists. The night of the Laughing Tree, she challenged and beat 3 knights and demanded they teach their squires honor. Rhaegar demanded the knight be beat when the lists begun the next day, but your mother never turned up. Aerys, seeing treason and treachery everywhere, convinced himself the knight was out for him, so he ordered everyone to find the knight, but no one did. Or so we thought, when your father brought back only the shield. Finally, the day of the final jousts came about. Your father rode against Sir Arthur in the semi-final, and Sir Barristan in the final. You should have seen it, Jon. Seeing your father ride against the 2 greatest knights in the realm, Arthur and he rode a great tilt. But the match against Sir Barristan was incredible. When your father won, the cheers of the crowd were deafening. He picked up the crown, blew winter roses, and rode past his wife, the Princess Ia, and laid the wreath in your mother's lap. The day the smiles died, they called it. Jon folded the cloak and placed it reverently back in the chest. He wiped his eyes and took out the letters. The first was a marriage certificate, the second an annulment. The other 2 were letters, one addressed to Doran and Oberyn Martell, and the other to Jacaerys. He had spent the last 2 days looking at the letter without opening it, fearful of what it may contain. Jacaerys' tale had shaken him to his core, made him question everything, and he knew some of the answers were in that letter, but he was scared to open it. I don't know what happened after the tourney, Jon, only that Robert was wroth and people assumed Atio was humiliated. If she was, I do not know, but seeing those letters, I feel there was more to it than people knew. A year later, your mother disappeared. Your uncle Brandon rode to the Red Keep and demanded Rhae to come out and die, believing you mother to be kidnapped. Rosieres had him arrested, and your grandfather was ordered to come to King's Landing. You know what happened next. Jon and I won't speak on it, not now, not ever. Other than to say, Aerys was a madman, no one could have predicted what he'd do. Jon opened the letter. My dearest son, I wish I could hold you in my arms and tell you how much I love you. But my time is near, and I know now I'll never have the chance to watch you grow. To see your smile and wipe your tears, soothe your hurts, or teach you to ride. There is so much I wish I could tell you, my precious boy. So much I long to see before I go. But I go to your father, and while it pains me to leave you, I shall see my love again, and for that I'm grateful. You were the one thing we did right, the one thing in this world that I feel nothing but pride for. My son, you are the best of us, the best of both of us. Your father called you the song of ice and fire. In this he is right, for no greater song has been sung than yours will surely be. I'm sorry we can't be there with you, to see you become the man you were born to be. I tried, my son. I sent letters. I trusted people to deliver them to my father, and I know not why they never reached him. We caused this, though it was not our intent. We caused this, and though I know it's a heavy burden to bear. Only you can set things right. The truth must be told, my son, Robert knew, and kept it to himself. He knew how I felt, and that I left with Rhaegar willingly, yet lied to further his own ends. Both he and Jon Arryn and others had planned to depose your family for years. I know not if my father was a willing or unwilling participant. I fear the truth, my son, that he was willing. I left letters with Lysay, and why she did not deliver them, I know not. I sent ravens to Winterfell, and why they were not answered. It is beyond my thinking. I loved your father from the moment I met him. He loved me too. Aelia had her reasons, but she knew of us long before your father gave me that accursed crown. We thought it would work out, and as I lay here now, I still know not how it went so wrong. When you're ready, these things will prove you birthright. Go see your great uncle at the wall. Aemon's a good man, and knows more than any of the burdens you now carry. You are the prince that was promised to us, my son. Fulfill that promise, be the man you were born to be, the king the realm needs. I shall watch over you, my sweet boy, for now and forever know that I love you with all my heart. Your loving mother, Lyanna Targaryen. Jon allowed the tears to fall freely as he read the letter. All his life he wished to learn of his mother. He held the letter in his hand and looked into the chest, the gold of the harp he longed to play, but had not touched, the letters, the beautiful cloak. He looked to the sword and to the egg that rested in the fire. His mother had held these things for him. His birthright, Jaime had called it. This was who he was, who he had been born to be. A king raised as a bastard. As he laid the letter down, Ghost came over to him. He rubbed his hand against the wolf's fur and felt the sadness in his heart lift just a little. He stood up and walked to the egg, looking down on it as Ghost followed behind him. He was a wolf and a dragon, but from now on no longer could he be a bastard. From now on, Jon knew he could only be a king. Jaime. The last 2 days had been a nightmare. After he had told Jon the truth, the boy had asked him to leave, and had since stayed in his room and refused to see anyone. Not even Joy had been allowed to see him. He knew that the news he'd given him was life-changing, that he'd spun the world on its axis, and now he was starting to regret both the way he did it and the mere fact he'd done it at all. He had tried his best to break the news gently, but the shock of it, of everything, was obviously weighing heavily on Jon. He, too, had closed himself off, though not as much as Jon had. He'd taken his meals as normal and tried to appear as if nothing was on his mind. But he was fooling no one, and if things didn't change soon, he knew he'd have to answer questions he just wasn't ready for. Tyrion and Jenna were already beginning to question him, and Jerian wouldn't be too far behind. He went over the moment he told Jon the truth in his mind constantly, trying to figure out if he could have been more gentle with it. Are you my father? No, Jon, I'm not, but you're more a son to me than any I could ever have. Then who? Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen, your mother Lyanna Stark. Jon looked at him before his shoulders slumped. It took him a moment to realize what may be going through the boy's head. No, Jon, it wasn't like that. They were in love. They married, Jaime said quickly. But how? What about Princess Aelia? I'm not certain, Jon, but there's a letter both from her and your mother. I'm sure there are answers there. Where's the letter, my lord? Jaime moved to the chest and opened it. Your mother kept these things for you, Jon. It's your birthright. Jaime said as he took the letters out and handed them to him. What's that? Jon said, picking up the cloth-covered sword. It's yours, Jon, from your father, Jaime said as Jon uncovered Dark Sister. Is this? Aye, Jon, Dark Sister, the blade wielded by Visenya herself. He watched as the boy looked at the blade, the same awe and reverence on his face that he himself had no doubt shown when he saw it. Finally, Jon put the sword down and Jaime handed him the cloak. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers slightly caressing the wolf sigil. Your mother's maiden cloak, Jaime said, and saw Jon's eyes begin to tear up. He turned away and picked up the dragon egg and held it in his hands while Jon looked at the cloak. When he eventually put the cloak down, he handed him the egg. Is this a dragon egg? Jon asked as he took the egg in his hands. Aye, it is. It's warm and it's moving, Jon said, shocking Jaime. Are you sure? Feel it. Jaime placed his hand on the egg and nearly jumped from his seat. The egg was hot, almost scalding, and he could definitely feel movement under the scales. He looked at Jon, who was staring intently at the egg, almost like he was in a trance before he finally put the egg down on the bed. Jaime reached over to touch the egg again, and this time it was cold. No movement at all. He couldn't understand it. Was it a Targaryen thing? He wasn't sure. No one had ever spoken of such a thing to his knowledge. So what now? Jon asked. That's up to you, Jon. Whatever you decide, I'll be there for you. Jaime said as Jon just nodded, the look on his face one he couldn't quite place. I think I need to be on my own for a while, Jon said. Very well, Jon. These things no one can know of them. You understand that, right? I do. Thank you, my lord. As he sat there playing events over and over in his mind, he was unaware that after 2 days, it seemed that Jon had enough time to work things out in his head. My lord, may we speak? He heard Jon's voice, and turned to see the boy smiling at him. Of course, Jon. How are you feeling? Much better, my lord, thank you. Jon sat down and Jaime stared at him intently. He looked much better than he had when he'd left him, much more settled, and Jaime hoped he'd begun to come to terms with the revelations. What do you want to speak of, Jon? What do we do now, my lord? That's up to you, Jon. Jon sat down and Jaime waited on him to speak. Whatever he decided Jaime would go along with. If he didn't want the throne, then that would be fine. But he hoped he would embrace his heritage. The realm needed a king they could be proud of, and Jaime was in no doubt that Jon would be that king. Jon, after having spent 2 days trying to come to terms with the revelation of who he was, who his parents were, Jon still had trouble trying to get it straight in his mind, combined with the fact he now also had a dragon egg, which for some reason he could hear speaking to him and was feeding it blood, and it was a wonder he hadn't gone as mad as his now known to be grandfather. He had decided that sitting around stewing over things had gone on long enough. The egg had thankfully stopped calling him for now. Though he'd left it resting in a still burning fire, with ghosts watching over the room so no one could enter. Now after making his way to the one man who could give him answers, he found he was lost for words. The questions he wanted to ask all jumbled together in his head. Jon, are you all right? Jaime asked. Sorry, my lord. I was just thinking, he replied sheepishly. That's understandable given what you've learned. Jaime smiled at him, which he returned. Did you know when you met me, my lord? Jon asked after a moment. I suspected when I saw you first, but it took me a while to be certain. So that's why you wanted me as your squire, Jon said, his voice tinged with sadness as he looked down at his lap. Jon, look at me, Jaime said, forcing him to look back up. Yes, originally when I saw you, that's why. But Jon, don't think that's the only reason. I wanted you to live a better life, to not have to worry about people looking down upon you. You were born a king, Jon, and you deserved more than you'd been given. But if I hadn't been, then it wouldn't have mattered, would it? Honestly, I don't know, but what I can say is, the more time I spent with you, the more we sparred, talked, and japed together, the less it became about the king, and the more it became about it being you. Jon looked Jaime in the eye. He could see he was speaking honestly with him. Could see the way he was looking at him, that he was both worried and concerned about him. It was the same look he gave him when he was recovering from his illness after the tourney. He knew that look, had longed for it all his life. Years before, at Winterfell, he'd see his father look at Robb when he was learning how to ride that way, had seen Lady Catelyn look at Sansa when she had hurt herself from falling and was having the scrape on her knee attended to. Yet for him that look never came, not when he fell ill or suffered a hurt, not even when he cried himself to sleep, after the lady had told him he was not her son but a bastard. Thank you, my lord, Jon said. For what, Jon? For bringing me here, for allowing me to spend time with your family. Jon, you're a part of my family. Never doubt that. You're as much a part of this family as Tyrion, or Jurian, is. You understand? You're more than just my king, Jon. Jon could feel his heart swell at Jaime's words. From the moment he'd come here, he'd felt different. Being treated differently. He wasn't the bastard of Winterfell here. He was Jon. Here he had friends. People who cared about him, and for the first time in his life, he was allowed to not be ashamed of what he was, or what he thought he was. Suddenly a thought hit him, and he couldn't shake it, no matter how much he tried. Do they know, Tyrion, Jurian, do they know the truth? He asked worriedly. No, Jon, they don't. They treat you as they do because of you, Jon. Not because you're the rightful king, but because, to them, you're someone more important, your family. Jon nodded his head. He didn't know what he'd think if they'd known, if they'd been treating him this way because of who he really was rather than who they thought he was. With Joy, it was simple. He loved the girl, and she him, simply because of who they were. Who knows, my lord? Apart from me, your Uncle Ned and Sir Barristan. Jon felt his breath catch in his throat. Sir Barristan, the bold himself, knew the truth. He had briefly met the man and tried to remember it in his head. Tried to remember if there had been a sign he'd missed. But he couldn't. As far as he could recollect, there was none. How does Sir Barristan know? At the tourney, Jon, he saw some of the same things I saw. But when he saw you fight, Jon, he knew, so he spoke and he declared himself for you. He's been working with me in the background ever since, Yakimor said as he looked to him. Declared himself for me. Jon said, his shock clear. Both he and I are the first to declare for Jaime Targaryen the third of his name. Jaime smiled at him. Why, my lord, why me? You've seen the King Jon and seen the Queen. From what I've heard, the prince is no better either. Not only are you the rightful king, but you'd be a better one than that fat oaf or his son. But how do you know, my lord? Jon said, shaking his head. Donan, do you know that the king borrowed 1,000,000 gold dragons from my father? Despite being left a full treasury, he managed to waste it all on tourneys and fine wines, feasts, and whores. This is the king we have on the throne. Jon, this is the man who stole your birthright. But how do you know I'd be any better? Jon, look what you've done here already. Look at my niece, my nephews, what you did at Castamere, with the ships, the trade deal with the North. That was all you, Jon, no one else. Why did you do those things? Because they were the right things to do, my lord. That's why you'd make a better king, Jon. You'd do the right thing, naturally, without thinking about it, without thinking of how it'd benefit you. You just do it. Would you accept Castamere? No, Castamere belongs to Juriel and Joy after him. Jon said loudly, horrified by the notion. You see, who else would do that for what you've done? Giving you lordship of Castamere would be a small price to pay. Yet you wouldn't accept it, not just now because you know Joy would get it, but had I offered it to you, you'd have told me to keep it. You didn't do what you did for a reward, Jon. That's what a true king should be like. Jon sat there trying to take in what Jaime was saying. Was it true? A king should try to make the lives of his subjects better, and Jon knew should he ever be in a position to do so, it would be his first priority. But was that enough? Surely there was more to it than that. So it's just you, Barristan, and my uncle then. No one else? As far as I know, Jon, that's it. The Tyrells? What? No, why would you, Jon? They're your friends? Because of you, Jon? Trust me, if the Tyrells knew of you, they'd be looking to make an alliance immediately. So Laura's being sent here isn't that then? He looked at Jaime, who for a moment seemed deep in thought. Why that conniving old witch? Jaime laughed. My lord? Olenna, the Queen of Thorns. I missed it. She actually managed to pull one on me. Jaime smirked as he shook his head. My lord, I don't understand. You were almost right, Jon, Jaime said, and Jon felt his chest tighten. If they knew, then it meant Marguerite knew, and that would mean that everything they shared, letters, gifts, the times they'd met had all been an act. She wasn't truly his friend. She was playing a game. Jon, they don't know all right, Jaime added when he saw the look in Jon's face. But Lors, my lord, Jon Lors was sent because Olenna wants to find out about what we're doing, probably about you too. Not because they know or even suspect the truth, but because of what we're doing in the West, what you've done. Jon, you've made waves, Yanta said proudly. Jon nodded his head as he breathed a sigh of relief. The thoughts that Marguerite didn't see him as a friend had luckily only been brief. Jon didn't dare think how he'd have felt if it had been the truth. My lord, what do we do now? Jon asked. As I said, Jon, that's up to you. Do you want it? The throne, your birthright? I do, my lord. It's what my mother wanted for me, what my father wanted, and I want it, my lord. I want to be king. Tyrion. He looked out at the ship as it was being prepared. The whole family would be traveling on it, and even though he had no desire to go to King's Landing, the thoughts of them all going made the trip seem worthwhile. He knew how much Joy would love sailing, especially on this ship, as he'd been stunned to see just how luxurious their cabins were. When he'd come to see the ship close up for the first time, he'd been amazed it dwarfed the largest of their ships considerably, and yet somehow it could still manage to dock just as easily as a much smaller ship. The captain had tried to explain it to him, but he drifted off, the man speaking of things he knew not nor cared not to find out about. Instead, Tyrion had been much more interested to see the ship in action, to see how it glided across the water, to feel how steady the deck was as you walked on it. When he'd gone down to see the cabins, he'd been amazed by their quality. There was a large dorm-style segment for crew and a number of cabins for the officers, all of which were of much better quality than paying cabins he'd used before. The guest cabins, though, were something else. Each of them as large as 3 normal cabins, fitted out with a comfortable bed, a desk, space to store your things, and a place to wash up. All in all, the trip to King's Landing would be very comfortable. Quick, too, if Kevin was right, these ships moving almost twice or sometime 3 times the speed of one of their smaller ships. How Jon had come up with the design for such a masterpiece of shipcraft was beyond him, but the boy's achievements should no longer really surprise him given Castamere alone. Thinking of Jon made him worry for the lad. He'd not been himself since he'd arrived back from Castamere. Even seeing him with Joy seemed off somewhat. He'd spoken to Tyrion and Jenna about it, and between them had resolved to make sure that on the journey to King's Landing they'd find out just exactly what was going on with the boy. "My lord, everything's in order, I trust?" Darpus, the captain, asked. "Aye, it is, captain. This ship is, I've never seen the like." "Aye, it's special, my lord. A pleasure to sail, and captain is the Lady Joanna." Tyrion smiled. The flagship of the Lannister fleet wasn't named after his brother. Jaime having gone out of his way to keep Tywin's name and legacy as far away from anything they were doing now. Even Kevin had agreed, once he saw the true horror of Castamere. So the 5 pinnacles of the Lannister fleet had been named instead. The Lion's Mane, the Lion's Roar, the Lion's Tail, the Lion's Bite, and the Lady Joanna and Tyrion couldn't help but smirk at Kevin's naming process. "Uncle, the next one is to be named after my mother. You can have another lion later." Jaime said exasperatedly, "Of course, my lord. I'll ensure the last one is more suited for family, as is befitting the flagship itself." Having checked the ship thoroughly, Tyrion disembarked and walked to the tavern that Tyrion owned. It had taken his nephew a while, but he'd finally managed to turn the tavern into something he was incredibly proud of. Now every time they were in Lannisport, it was here they'd go for a meal or a drink, rather than stop off at Kevin's residence. His brother had begun work on his seat, and it would be incredibly impressive. Looking out into the bay itself, the castle he was building was huge, and would take many years to complete. But he knew that for Kevin, just like him with Castamere, he wasn't building it for himself. Until then, his brother had stayed in the large residence they owned when in town, which he was more often than not now, although now with the fleet he did sail a fair bit also. "My lord," the serving girl said as he walked into the tavern. "The usual, Caron," he said, and sat down. After a few moments, the girl brought him his meal, some clam soup and white wheat bread to start, followed by a crab pie, with some northern ale to wash it down, courtesy of their deal with the Manderleys. The ale had been a surprise hit in the Westerlands. Something about it making the seafood fare taste much better, and adding to the flavor, had made it most sought after. He sat in silence and finished the soup quickly, before taking his time to savor the pie. The creamy sauce spiced just the right amount. He relished every bite as he washed it down with the ale. After drinking another mug of ale, he called Karen over and paid for the meal. The extra silver stags he gave the girl, making her smile that much bigger. They'd be leaving on the morrow, so he left for the ride back to Casterly Rock. Jenna had said she'd prepare Joy's things, and his little girl was looking forward to the adventure. No doubt, he smiled. If there was one thing he really appreciated about having Jon come stay all those years ago, then it was his daughter's love of adventure. He nodded to his guards. They, having already eaten earlier, had allowed him to have his meal alone, got up on his horse, and they began the ride home. Jaime, he and Jon had spoken for close to an hour or two now, and while they discussed some of what was needed, they hadn't really gotten to the heart of the matter. He was happy Jon had decided to aim for his birthright. Had he not, he'd have supported him, of course. But the boy belonged on the throne, and he was glad he hadn't just came in and told him he didn't want it. "You hungry, Jon?" "Aye, I could eat, my lord." "Come on, let's grab something. We can come back here to finish our talk afterwards." "Aye, sounds good." Jaime got up and walked to the door with Jon following. They made their way down to the dining hall, passing Ghost on their way. Jon leaned down to pet the wolf before quickly walking into his room. Jaime deciding to follow. When he got inside, he was surprised to see the fire burning in the fireplace, and he looked on as Jon added more wood before he noticed the white scales of the dragon egg in the grate. "Is that the egg, Jon?" "Aye, my lord. One more thing we need to speak about." Yaxley nodded, and they left the room. Jon closing the door and leaning down to Ghost again. He looked up to see the wolf ready to follow them, and as they walked, they bumped into one of the servants. "My lord, Jon. Your room, aye. Should I clean it now, Jon?" the girl asked. "No, it's fine, Alice. I'll look after it. Don't worry on it, all right," Jon said, smiling at her. "All right, Jon. As you say, my lord." She smiled at Jon before giving him a small curtsy. They entered the dining hall to see Jaina sitting there with her boys and Caven's two youngest sons, and Joy, who immediately ran to Jon. "Jon," she said happily, as he grabbed her and gave her a spin. "Oh, Joy, what have you been doing?" "Auntie made me sew and wouldn't let me ride apples," the girl said, looking daggers at Jaina. "That's not very nice, is it?" "No, can we ride Jon, please?" She looked at him, her eyes large and lip quivering, and Jaime couldn't help his smirk. The boy had no hope. "Let's eat first. Then I'll find Loras and we'll go for a ride." "All right." Lorzier chad Jon. "Well, me, you, and Ghost will cheer him up, won't we?" Jon said, and Joy nodded enthusiastically. They sat down, and immediately the boys peppered Jon with talk of spars and the tourney, asking him if he'd fight in the duels and could they join him on his ride. Jaime looked to his aunt, who smiled at him, happy just like him to see things returning to normal. They ate a small meal, Joy feeding a clearly happier Ghost from Jon's plate, and Jon laughing with the boys, who all seemed glad to see him. "Everything all right?" his aunt said quietly, nodding to Jon. "Getting there, Aunt, getting there." After they finished the meal, Jon said they'd speak later this evening, so he allowed the boy go off and have some fun. They'd be discussing some things that wouldn't allow for it much later, he knew, so he might as well enjoy himself for now. He decided to head to Tyrion's Solar, knowing that his brother would be preparing for the journey. Lozier lay on his bed staring up at the ceiling. He had tried to speak to Jon, but hadn't been allowed into his room, while Jaime at least was speaking to him. Their spars had stopped, and Jon hadn't been out of his room since he called him a bastard. He had felt terrible at the time once he realized what he'd said. He was in disbelief that he actually said it, ever since he'd been trying to replay it in his mind, trying to figure out just why he'd called Jon that. He had never thought of Jon as a bastard. Sure, he knew it was the truth. It was what he was, but Jon was so unlike any bastard he had known that he never saw him that way. Jon was as his sister called him. Just Jon. He was fun and kind, and he loved the same things. Loras did. From the moment he'd met him, he had felt him a friend, and ever since coming to Casterly Rock, he felt that more keenly. Lorzier knew he was different. He felt different. When girls would smile at him, he'd be polite and friendly, but when a boy would do the same, it felt different, more intense somehow, but with Jon it felt different again. With Jon it was like being with Garland, except without the feeling of inferiority, even though, just like Garland, he was much better than Loras at things. With Jon it always felt like he wanted Loras to improve, to get better, where at times with Garland it felt like he was disappointed. Jon was like a brother to him. In a lot of ways, he was what at times he'd hoped Garland would be, an older brother who didn't judge or belittle him when he got stuff wrong. He loved Garland, and his brother didn't mean anything by it, but still at times it hurt. With Jon, though, it never felt that way. When they ribbed each other or japed at the other's expense, it felt different. "Loras, can I come in?" He heard Jon's voice at the door and jumped from his bed. "Yes, of course. Please." Loras. "Jon, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. I swear I don't know why I said it." Lorzier babbled as soon as Jon entered. "It's fine, Loras. I know that. Look, we're heading out for a ride. Why don't you get ready and come join us?" I can come with you." "Of course, you're my friend, Loras. Friends say stupid stuff to one another all the time. It's done, forgiven, and forgotten." Loras grabbed Jon in a tight hug. He was glad to feel his friend hug him back. "Now come on, Jai's probably driving Alice, and Jai's crazy. Apparently she's not been allowed near apples while I was sulking," Jon said with a laugh. Loras laughed back and went to grab his things. He and Jon walked down to the lift together, laughing and joking all the way, and Loras felt relieved. His friend had forgiven him. He would do everything he could to ensure that he earned that forgiveness. That evening, the day's riding had been fun. Jon and Joy had raced off as usual, with Ghost chasing after them. He and the boys had slowly trotted, none of them willing to engage in a race with the best two-horse riders in the Rock. Joy was incredible to watch on a horse, just like Jon on Winter. Seeing her on apples was like seeing someone born to ride a horse. They had raced, mock sparred with the boys, had some food by the stream they usually went to. At one point, Joy had tried to climb onto Ghost's back, much to the wolf's annoyance. Finally, they had come back to the Rock. The evening meal that night was the best he'd had in a few days. The food itself, nothing special, but the company so much more so. They had laughed and japed, and he could see even the older Lannisters seemed happy to have Jon back amongst them. "Are you excited about the tourney?" he said to Jon as they walked towards his room. "Hey, you." "Definitely. I'll bet my sister will be glad to see you also." "I hope so. I missed the last tourney." Was she very cross? "No, Marge's not like that." She was disappointed, but it couldn't be helped. Besides, your letter cheered her up. "Well, I shall do my best to stay healthy this time." Jon laughed. "Good. I want the chance to face you in the duels." "Really? That eager to lose, are you?" Jon bumped his shoulder, forcing him to laugh. "Also, who knows, maybe I'll surprise you this time." Lords looked at him out of the corner of his eye. "You may do." Jon nodded. "After the tourney I'll be heading north for a while. I'll probably be gone for 6 moons or so." Lors felt his heart drop. The 2 days without his friend had been the longest he'd known. 6 whole moons without him would be unbearable. "Can I come?" he asked, his voice quiet. "You want to?" Jon asked, looking him in the eye. "Aye, what are friends for?" Lewis smiled. "I'd love for you to come, if you're sure it's what you want. Aye, we'll have fun traveling besides. I've never seen the North." Lewis felt excited for the journey as he lay in his bed that night. First the tourney and then a trip to see Jon's home. It would be an adventure, and he was glad he'd asked to go. The look on Jon's face had made it worthwhile. After the look he'd put there, calling his friend that word, he had resolved never to even think it, let alone say it again. Seeing the look on Jon's face when he asked to join him was priceless. Jon didn't realize just how much he needed to spend the day with everyone, just enjoying himself until he did it, riding with Joy, playing with the boys, speaking to Loras. All of it made him feel so much better. He stoked the fire and put more wood on it. The egg covered in the flames. When he was certain the fire would hold, he walked down to Jaime's rooms. He had read Joy her bedtime story and kissed her goodnight, and the smile she gave him when he left the room made him feel much better. Nodding to Axles, who seemed glad to see him walking around and was now heading off to his own quarters. Jon walked down the corridor, and when he arrived at Jaime's, he knocked before entering. Jaime was sitting at his desk, waiting apparently, and Jon took a seat and got ready to begin. All day he'd gone over what they'd discuss when he came back, and it kept coming back to one thing: what had happened that day in the Red Keep. He took a breath and got ready to ask the one question he'd never asked Jaime once. Why had he killed the king? He could see from the look in Jaime's eye that he knew what he was about to be asked. The worry and regret clear in his expression. "You want to know, don't you?" Jaime said resignedly, "I am sorry, my lord. I know it's hard, but I need to know." "Very well, but, Jon, there's some of it I won't say. I'm sorry, but some of it you're too young for. I'm not hiding anything, and if you want to know, then one day when you're older I'll speak of it. But for now, I can't outright." "That's fine, my lord. Tell me what you can, though," he smiled, as reassuringly as he could, but it had no effect. He could see, "Your grandfather was exactly as you've heard, Jon. He was cruel and violent, and as the days went on, it was clear he was losing his mind. The Mad King was the moniker he was given, and it was an apt one. After Duskendale, it got worse. He grew paranoid, thinking everywhere there were people out to get him, to overthrow him, or just plain plotting against him. He blamed my father mostly, never really forgave him for it, so from then on, the relationship between them was strained. My father had wanted Cersei to marry Rhaegar, usse, and your grandfather threw it in his face. 'I won't marry a prince to a servant's daughter,' your grandfather said, and my father, I believe, never forgave him for that. When I was named Kingsguard, it was the second proudest day of my life, Jon. It was only later did I realize it was not an honor, but a slight to my father, the final one he'd accept as he resigned, and went back to the Rock." Jaime stopped for a moment and took a large swallow from his mug, which he refilled with water before looking at Jon and nodding his head, and continuing. "When the rebellion started, your father was nowhere to be found. We know now why that was. But Aerys, Jon, Aerys saw betrayal everywhere. He ordered Sergerold to find him and bring him to him and refused to allow Aye and the children to leave, believing he needed them as hostages. Your father soon arrived, and I begged to be allowed to join him in battle. I pleaded with him, Jon, but he refused. Aerys had never seen me as a Kingsguard. You see, to him I was a hostage too, used to ensure my father's complicity. The last words you father ever spoke to me was to tell me to keep his family safe, to protect them until he returned, that things would change when he did so, and I failed him, Jon. I failed them. Jon jumped from his chair as Jaime began to sob. He rushed behind the table and threw his arms around the man. When he had broken down, it was Jaime who had comforted him, and Jon did his best to do the same. You didn't fail them all, my lord. I'm here. I know the truth, thanks to you, Jon said, and refused to let go of the crying man. It took a few moments for the tears to stop, for Jaime to stop shaking. Jon never let go, though, and only when Jaime nodded to him did he move away. We don't need to discuss any more, my lord. We've spoken enough, Jon said. No, Jon, I need to tell you what happened. You need to know. If you're sure, my lord. Aye. Jon moved back to his seat and sat down and waited for Jaime to continue. When news hit the Red Keep of the Trident and your father's death, Aerys ordered the gates closed and preparations to be readied for the siege. He also ordered his new hand, Rhaegar, to make sure the surprise was ready. When my father arrived at the gate, Varys advised your grandfather to not allow him to enter. Pycelle, that toad, advised he should trust my father, which he did much to his regret. My father's men sacked the city, and when your grandfather realized what had happened, he ordered me to bring him his head. He ordered Rhaegar to light the wildfire and shouted that he would burn them all. Wildfire, my lord? Jon asked. Aye, he had planted it all through the city. One spark would be enough to set it off. He'd kill all his enemies and like a true dragon rise from the flames. Or so he believed. But the people, surely he realized that he'd kill all the people, my lord. Jon? He was beyond mad at that point. He didn't care. I can still hear him saying it. Burn them all. Burn them all. I couldn't let it happen. I had no choice. You must believe me, Jon. Please, you must believe me. Jaime! It's fine. You did what was right. What was just. Don't ever think otherwise. I don't. Jane said, and Jaime looked at him, shaking his head. I broke my oath, Jon, my oath to your family. I was supposed to protect the king. Instead, I stabbed him in the back. Look at me, Jon said, and Jaime looked up at him. You did what was right, what honor demanded, and even if it didn't, you saved countless lives. You're a hero. Jaime, a hero. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. But, no, anything after the word but is bullshit. Am I your king? You are. Of course you are. Then as your king, I pardon you, I forgive you, and if I say you're a hero, then damn it, Jaime, you're a hero. I broke my oath, Jaime said angrily. To a madman? You broke an oath to a madman, but you upheld an even greater oath. You protected the innocent. How many did you save that day? How many men, women, and children lived? How many grew to have children of their own? I killed you, grandfather, Jaime said softly. Who killed my other grandfather and uncle? You killed a kinslayer, Jaime. A madman who would have laughed as thousands burned to death. No man has ever deserved to die more than he. I didn't save them. Don't you get it? I didn't save them. Jaime cried loudly. Did you know what your father had planned? No, of course not. Yaime's anger clear in his voice. Then you thought you had saved them, Jaime. Look at me. Jaime looked up at him. It wasn't your fault, you hear me. It wasn't your fault. Jon watched as the tears fell from Jaime's face. It took a few moments, but finally he nodded at him and Jon nodded back. Jaime got up from his seat and walked into the other room. He was gone for some time. Jon sat there on the chair, thinking over what he'd been told. It had never sat right with him that the man he knew as Jaime Lannister was the same man people called Oathbreaker and Kingslayer. That Jaime he knew was honorable, he realized that very early on. So him breaking an oath didn't make sense. He had heard his fat uncle once say that Jaime had killed the king on the orders of his father, but that made no sense to Jon. Not now he knew him. Jaime held no love for his father. The things he'd done disgusted him. He'd seen that clearly at Castamere, so his uncle was wrong. But why hadn't Jaime told anyone? Why had he allowed his name to be sullied when his actions should have brought him acknowledgement? When people should have realized just exactly what he'd done and why? Do you wish to talk more, or should we leave it for the morrow? Jon asked when Jaime walked back in the room. No, let's finish as much as we can tonight. We'll be busy tomorrow with the preparations for the journey. You're still going right? I want to see it. I need to see it. Jon said determinedly. Good, then what? I don't know, I think I want to travel north. I need to speak with my uncles. Your uncles? Aye, all three of them. Benjen and Aemon at Castle Black, and I needs must speak with Uncle Ned. I have to know, I need to know. I understand, but why Castle Black? It's about the egg and other things. I've been hearing things, seeing things. I don't understand it. There are voices and dreams and this, Jon said, holding his hand up. When? How did that happen? Jaime said worriedly, looking at the cut on his palm. I did it, Jon said, looking down at his lap. You lie. Yamin confusedly asks, I don't know how to explain it. Ever since I held the egg, there's been a voice in my head calling me, telling me to wake it up. I don't know why, but when I heard the voice, I felt the need to cut myself to allow the blood drip on the egg. Now, though, the voice has stopped, as if I've done what I'm supposed to. Now, just keeping it in the fire, always keeping it warm, just seems right. I don't know. It just feels right. Fire and blood, Jaime whispered. What? Fire and blood, your house's words. This must be something to do with that. That's why I need to speak with Aemon. He's the only family I've got that would know. That and my mother's letter told me to talk to him, that I need to talk with him. All right, well, what if we take the ship north after the tourney? We could sail to Eastwatch and go to Castle Black from there. Aye, we could do that. I need to speak to Benjen, too. We could travel to Winterfell afterwards. Jon, are you sure that's what you want? Are you really ready for that? Jaime asked concernedly. I need to, my lord. There are things only my uncle would know. Also the letter, my mother, the things she said, if true, my lord, I need to know. Not Jaime, Jaime Jip. Sorry, my lord, Jon said, shaking his head. Earlier you called me Jaime, I think for the first time. You were upset, my lord. I thought it appropriate. No, Jon, it was fine. I prefer it. This my lord stuff is too formal anyway. It's proper, my lord. Should anyone see different, it would raise questions. Jon watched as Jaime nodded in agreement. At some point, the dynamic between them would shift. It had probably already started too, but until Jon was crowned, Jaime was a lord and he was just a squire. Very well, for now, we'll keep it as it is. But you're my king, Jon. At some point, we're going to have to address what that means. I know, my lord. We can discuss it more as we go on. As you wish, your grace, Jaime said with a smirk. Careful. I can order you about now, you know, Jon said, and they both laughed. You can, anyway. Is there anything else, or is that it? Jaime asked. We need to tell them, my lord, soon. I know, Jon. I've wanted to tell them for a long time. Jaime sighed. Why didn't you? I needed to tell you first, before anyone else. It had to be you knowing first. Jon smiled at that. He was glad that no one else knew just yet. What they'd feel about the news when they heard it worried him a little. Would it change how they thought of him, how they acted around him? Would he go from being Jon to being Jackreys in their minds? He hoped not. He hoped they'd see him the same as they did now, that they accepted him just as they had when he'd arrived, but he worried all the same. It'll be fine, Jon. They'll take it well. What if they don't? Then we'll figure things out. Jaime said, and Jon nodded in agreement. We should wait to tell them until we come back from the north, Jon said determinedly. I think that's for the best, so we're agreed. We'll go north after the tourney. Aye, Jon replied. What about Loras? Jaime asked. We're good, my lord. We've spoken. All is well. He wishes to come north with us. Fine if that's what you want. It's getting late, and we have an early move to make on the morrow. Let's get some rest. I think you're right, my lord, Jon said as he got up from his seat. He walked to the door only for Jaime to call him back. My lord? He watched unstunned as Jaime took out his sword and knelt on the ground. I, Jaime Lannister, do hereby pledge my sword and counsel to the true King James Targaryen, the third of his name. I shall shield his back, smite down his enemies, do his bidding, and follow no orders but his. This I swear from this day to my last. Jon felt his heart sore. His lord, his friend, his mentor, had sworn to him. To a boy raised as a bastard, the greatest knight in Westeros had sworn his blade to him. I vow that you shall always have a place at my hearth and mead at my table. I pledge to ask no service of you that might bring you into dishonor. I swear it by the old gods and the new. Arise, my lord, your king welcomes your service, and will always value your counsel. Jaime stood back up and Jon grabbed him in a hug. Yes, I may. They broke their fast early the next morn, Joy barely awake as they ate. She actually fell asleep in Jon's arms at the table, and Alessia needed to grab her to take her down to the waiting carriage. He had sent a raven to their property in King's Landing to ready it for their arrival, also with a note for Velar to ensure the surprise was ready for Jon and Loras once they arrived. That morning during their spar, he had felt lighter than he had in a number of days. Jon, too, was back more to himself. The two had japed more, and he was happy to see that while the news had changed some things between them, most still stayed the same. He watched on as their horses were loaded onto the ship. Winter and Honor would be coming with them, and Loras had asked to bring Bluebell too, so Jaime had agreed. For the rest of their retinue north, he'd purchase horses in White Harbor, Jon having convinced him to make a longer stop off there than he'd planned. "My lord, we're ready to cast off as soon as you are," Darpas said. "Very well, Captain. Give the order." Everyone else had quickly made their way down to their cabins, all but Jon, who stood at the ship's bow holding an excited Joy who was waving at the people on the docks, ghostly in front of them, and Jaime couldn't help but smirk at the uncomfortable look on the wolf's face. Jon had needed to coax the wolf on board earlier. He walked towards them and could hear his niece's voices repeating what Jon said as he drew closer. "Say bye-bye, Joy. Bye-bye." And to the birdies. "Bye-bye, birdies." He saw Alessia and called her over, tasking her to take Joy down to her father. "No want to stay, Jon." "I know, Princess. Go with Alessia for now. I'll come down in a little while. I promise." "Promise?" "Aye, Princess," Jon said, and Jaime smiled at his niece. Saw him. "Bye-bye, Nuncle." "Bye-bye, Princess." He leaned down to kiss her forehead. Once Alessia and Joy were gone, he stood beside Jon watching as Lannisport faded from view. Things would change once they came back from this journey. The rules of the game would be different. "You ready for this, Jon?" "Aye, I was born ready." Jon smirked. "That you were my king, that you wore." King's Landing, 2003 AC. Jaina. Traveling by ship was long and arduous and incredibly boring, even on this monstrosity that her nephews had somehow managed to have built. Kevin was absolutely delighted with both the design and how quickly they were now able to construct one of these large pinnacle ships, as he called them. The first one, the Lion's Roar, had taken almost a full year to build. Almost 2,000 men had labored over it, and that was without the countless number of craftsmen who made the rigging, sails, and other parts of the ship. This ship, the Lady Joanna, was built in a little less than 6 moons. Each time they'd built one, they'd refined the process, and were now building numerous ships at the same time. The small folk in Lannisport had never had it so good, and Kevin was practically revered by them. She knew the cost was incredible, but in less than a year of working the Lion's Roar had almost paid for itself. The sheer amount of cargo it could carry, the speed at sea while it made journeys, even in Brovos, it was practically legendary already. Jenna loved walking the deck, the steadiness of it surprising her every time. Not once since they'd left Lannisport had she felt the sickness of the sea, which she was most grateful for. "Auntie, look at the birdies," Joy said, running up from behind her. "They're pretty, aren't they, Joy?" "Pretty birdies, Auntie," the little girl said, smiling as a gull ducked below the water. "Ouch, fishy," Joy said as the bird came back up with a fish in its mouth. "Come, Joy, let's go. It's lesson time." "No, Auntie. Birdies." Joy crossed her arms and stamped her foot. Jenna couldn't help but laugh. She wasn't Jon. That wouldn't work on her. "Joy," she said, rising her voice. The little girl huffed and turned, and they headed back down to the large dining area she'd commandeered for their lessons. She had only given them brief history lessons on King's Landing and the Red Keep itself, and had allowed Jon to fit in stories of knights, kings, and battles to keep her boys interested. Now, though, they were almost in sight of Blackwater Bay, so she knew she needed to begin telling the children how to behave. Loras and Jon would be no problem, and Joy would either be with Jon or Jeriane most of the time. But Lancel was at times even too arrogant to be a Lannister, while her boys and Kevin's youngest had never been in the presence of the royal family. "Jon!" she heard Joy shout as she ran to jump into Jon's arms, the sight never failing to make her laugh. "Hello, Joy! Where were you?" "On ship, Jon, seeing the birdies." "Did you see fishes, Joy?" "Birdie made fishy ouch, Jon," Joy said, and Jon grabbed her and began tickling her. "No, Jon, stop," she giggled. Jaina nodded at him, and he lifted Joy up and sat her on his lap while she grabbed a chair and sat down, her boys immediately looking to her, as did Morton and Willem. Lancel, though, sat there with a bored expression on his face. "Right, we're about to arrive at King's Landing, and there are things you need to know." "What things, Mother?" Taxon asked, and Walder giggled until she shot him a look. There are ways you need to behave while we're there, especially with the royal family. Now listen carefully. She looked around the room and noticed Lancel trying his best to look disinterested. You too, Lancel, she said, leaving no room in her voice for argument. Now what do we say when talking with ye king and queen? We call them your grace, auntie. Martin said shakily. Very good, Martin, she smiled at the boy. And the lords and ladies? My lord or my lady, auntie, Willem said, not wanting to be outshone by his brother. Very good, Willem. Now what do we do when we meet the king and queen, or the prince? We bow, mother, but Joy needs to curtsy, Tyson said smugly. That's right, Walder, show me how you bow. Her son got up and made a passable bow. She would work on it later with him and Tian. Joy, want to show me a curtsy? Joy looked at Jon in confusion before looking to her and back to Jon. Joy, say your grace, remember, Jon said, lifting the girl to the ground. Your grace, Joy said, and Jenna was stunned to see the girl give a far better curtsy than some older girls did. Well done, Joy. That was really good. She smiled and Joy laughed before Jon picked her up again. She wondered how he thought her that, but decided not to ask for now. The rest of the lesson went well. She felt at least the children would be fine if they had someone with them, which they would undoubtedly have in this place. Later that day, they had seen land and were moving into dock. Jenny stood with the children who were waving at those standing by the dockside. She was surprised to see Jon Arryn there, having not expected a welcome party. As the ship glided into its docking position, she reveled in the amazed looks, not just from the small folk, but from what was clearly sailors and captains of the other ships around them. The Lady Joanna easily dwarfed the largest ship on the docks, and she knew Jurian and Cavan had laughed loudly when they easily overtook the Fury while sailing across the bay. She had looked down on a clearly agitated Stannis as they passed. No doubt his teeth would be ground just a little more today. It didn't take long for the ship to dock, and they made their way down to be greeted. Lord Jaime, I welcome you to King's Landing. I thank you, Lord Hand, Jaime said. Lord Jurian, Lord Cavan, Jon Arryn said, greeting her brothers before moving to her. Lady Jenna, King's Landing has missed you, my lady. Jon Arryn said, trying to smile at her. I've not missed it, Lord Arryn, she said, even though she had. We've arranged for you to stay in the royal apartments, though we had not thought there would be so large a contingent of you. It's fine, Lord Hand. We'd prefer to stay in the family residence. It's much better for the children. Jaime said, My lord. If you're sure, my lord, Jon Arryn said. I think it's for the best, Lord Hand, Jaime said, and moved to get their things loaded on the carriages and carts that had arrived from their manse. Lord Cavan, I congratulate you on your appointment as Lord of Lannisport and Admiral of the Western Fleet, such a worthy appointment, and with a ship like that you must be proud, my lord. Jon Arryn said to her brother as he stared at the Lady Joanna. Aye, the Lady Joanna's a fine ship. She and the other pinnacle ships are most worthy. Cavan said. Others, my lord? Jon Arryn asked, worriedly. Aye, the Lady Joanna is one of 5 such ships, Cavan said proudly. She watched as Jon Arryn's face fell, then straightened once more. Good, let him fear the wrath of lions. If there was one thing her late departed brother had right, it was that sometimes a little fear was a good thing. Unfortunately, Tywin didn't understand that it needed to be used in moderation, something she was glad that Jaime did. After saying their farewells to a clearly perturbed Lord Arryn, they finally made their way to their residence. She was looking forward to this tourney, to the balls and the feasts. It had been far too long. It was a pity she had to bring Emmon with her, though. She sighed as she looked at the sleeping form of her husband in the carriage beside her. Marguerite! Their arrival at King's Landing was uneventful. They were met by the Hand, but not the king or prince, much to her grandmother's annoyance. Lord Arryn said flattering words to her father, which he lapped up, even though it was technically an insult to not be met by at least one member of the royal family. Something she knew her grandmother would rage about later on, for Marguerite, though she cared not about meeting the prince, and was instead looking forward to seeing Jon again. It had been 2 years since they had met, and she found she missed her friend. He was not like the other lords and heirs or spares she'd been forced to deal with since the wedding. Jon didn't brag of his achievements, or tell you how good he was, or what someone had said about him. He was just Jon, and she missed that a lot. Since the wedding, they'd had numerous balls and feasts. Her name days had come and gone, and each time there had been a gift from Jon awaiting her. The wolf brooch she wore every day. The rose-covered hand mirror she kept among her things. And the beautiful illustrated book she kept by her bedside. The pictures of castles and mythical beasts were beautifully drawn, almost coming alive as you looked at them. The letters she'd exchanged for Loras had been neatly tied in a bow and kept at the base of her jewelry box. Every so often she'd pick one to read and smile as she read of Jon's yentures with joy. When Loras arrived alone for the tourney, she'd been upset and a little annoyed. Had Jon not wanted to visit her, she worried, but when Loras told her he was ill and handed her the letter he'd written, she felt happy and relieved that he would soon recover. That letter was the one she liked reading the most. It always made her feel better when she was sad, to know that out there somewhere, her friend was thinking of her. "Is Jon not with you?" Marjorie asked after hugging her brother. "No, Marge. He took ill and wasn't able to travel." "Is he all right? Will he get better?" she asked worriedly. "Aye, he will be. Just needs to rest for a bit." "Oh," she said sadly, realizing that she wouldn't see him for who knows how long. "He did write you, though," Lord Sirius said, handing her Jon's letter. Later that day, she snuck off to a quiet area of the gardens and opened the letter. "Just Marjorie. I'm so sorry I couldn't come to see you this time. I swear I'll come visit you in your home one day soon. It seems the gods must hate me, for they've decided to make me ill. Just when I'd been looking forward to the visit more than anything. I wish I could be there to tell you of Joy and Ghost, of Loras and the adventures we have. Yankers Jon as Joy would correct me, were she there. I wish I could see you smile, make you laugh, sneak off away from everyone so we could dance. I shall count the days until I see my friend again, each one duller without you. Until then, I'll write and smile, and each day shall think of you. We'll see each other sooner rather than later, I hope. Your friend, just Jon." Marjorie smiled as she thought of the letter and the fact that Loras had confirmed in his raven that Jon would be joining him this time. She had barely noticed her grandmother's voice calling her, and she looked up sheepishly to find they'd arrived at their rooms in the maiden vault. Her grandmother had hoped to be settled in Maeka's holdfast itself, but for some reason they'd not been, and she knew this would add to her chagrin. "Marjorie, are you listening, child?" Olenna said a little louder. "I'm sorry, grandmother, what did you say?" "Never mind that, my dear. Are you well?" "I'm fine, grandmother, a little tired from the journey." "Well, you should take a nap, my dear. We can't have you tired when you meet the prince later on." "Of course, grandmother. I had hoped we'd be closer to the royal apartments, but for God's knows whatever reason we've been housed all the way over here. You'd think the damn royals would know better than to treat the family bankrolling them such a way." Olenna said, her voice rising as she spoke. "Mother," Mace said, shaking his head. "Oh, do shut up, Mace. You know I'm right. How is Marjorie supposed to spend time with the prince from over here? No, this will not do." Marjorie tuned out the inevitable argument to come. Her father would no doubt receive a tongue lashing, and her grandmother would bring it up again and again to both the king and Hand until she got her way. She herself had no wish to be any closer to the prince. Each time she'd met the boy, she'd been less and less impressed with him. The things she'd heard about him didn't fill her with any desire to know him better. One night, unable to sleep, she'd walked to her grandmother's room to overhear her grandmother speaking to Willis. She'd not been able to resist, so had leaned against the door and listened. "Apparently the boy likes to berate the servants, and worse," Willis said. "Worse?" she heard her grandmother ask. "Aye, I've heard tell that he has moved from berating and having them dismissed from service to arranging for beatings to occur in front of him." "Are you sure of this?" her grandmother said worriedly. "I am, grandmother. It's been told by a number of our spies. This is not good. The boy's the key to the throne. Should he continue like this?" The sound of footsteps forcing her to miss what else was said. "Can I help you, my lady?" Eric's voice said as he walked towards Marjorie. "No, Zier. I had come to speak to my grandmother, but she's busy. I shall talk to her on the morrow." "As you say, my lady," the guard said, and bowed. After that, she had tried to find out more about the prince when she'd brought it up with her grandmother or brother, though they'd changed the subject quickly, increasing rather than alleviating her concerns. She walked into her room and immediately went to the small jewelry box and took out the pile of letters. Picking one out, she began to read it, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep, the smile on her face unseen. Targaryen. The Lannister manse was impressive, as large as Caven's residence in Lannisport and surrounded by a large wall and garden. It had stables and a separate area for guards, as well as the large main house itself. Inside it was as would be expected of a Lannister property, extravagantly decorated, with large paintings of lions and lords of the rock and various ancestors. He shuddered as he looked at the imposing portrait of his father before moving to his rooms. Jaime had all the family along with Jon and Loras kept in the same wing of the house. The other side was kept for the rest of their accompaniment. Tyrion watched as his belongings were carried into the room, the large chest full of books, his pride and joy. Once it was done, he looked around glad to see the bed was comfortable and the desk neatly arranged. Haralder's steward had done a great job in preparing the place. He left his room and walked down to his brother, passing the various servants that were rushing around, making sure his family were settled. When he reached the room, he was surprised to see Jaime alone. His brother had kept Jon very close on this trip, and he expected to see the boy inside. Thankfully, that meant Ghost was nowhere around, the wolf having constantly done his best to scare Tyrion to death on their journey here. Brother, come sit. We'll be heading over to meet the king and our sweet sister very soon. Jaime said, and Tyrion sighed. Oh, what joy, he japed, and Jaime laughed. Come now, Tyrion. I'm sure you're looking forward to meeting the children, if nothing else. Two of them, perhaps, Tyrion said, having no wish to meet his eldest nephew if it could be helped. I needed to talk with you anyway, brother, Jaime said as Tyrion sat down. Of course, so what shall we discuss? The smell, or that we're no doubt going to be leaned upon for coin by the hand? Tyrion asked. Well, we can't do anything about the smell. As for the hand, the answer is no. We're not helping them, Tyrion. I'll leave it to you to figure out what to say. But we're not giving them one more dragon. Very well, so, anything else? I have a few things. Firstly, I shan't be returning to the Rock with you all. Jon and I will be heading north for a while, Jaime said, catching him by surprise. Yak, you can't. We've work to do, Tyrion said, shaking his head. No brother you have, you're my heir, my castellan. I trust you to keep things in order while I'm gone. There's no one I trust more, Jaime said with a smile. Tyrion felt the pride well up in his chest. No matter how many times Jaime made it clear he respected him or valued him, hearing it from his brother always managed to make him feel 10 feet taller. Of course, brother, I won't let you down. I know that, brother. Now the other thing is, it's time we began to play the game. There are things we need to know, players we must be aware of. I want you to begin to get the measure of them while we're here. Tyrion smiled brightly at this. He'd wanted to delve into the politics of the realm more. Up until now, he'd only done so in the West. He'd begun a network of spies and informants over the years and knew exactly who thought what in every castle in the Westerlands. He had learned secrets about lords that even his father had not known. To now get the chance to do so here was something he greatly looked forward to. He'd need to begin carefully, to start at the bottom, but he felt in time he could grow as big a network here as he had in the Westerlands. I'll bring you a list of people we can trust, people to watch out for, but I want you to start your own. I'm sure you can compare them both. Where will you get your list from? He asked. Oh, I have sources too, brother, Jaime smirked. Now, come, we have a king to bow to. The two brothers walked from the room, japing with each other as they did so. As they came to the end of the corridor, they were joined by Jon, Loras, and Joy. The two boys were holding her hands and swinging her in the air. The little girl's laughter was infectious, and both Tyrion and Jaime soon joined in. It was then Tyrion felt the by now usual tug on his britches. Where the wolf had come from was beyond him. But as Tyrion tried unsuccessfully to get him to stop, he was thankful to hear his cousin's voice. Ghost, come, Joy said as she ran down the corridor, the wolf in hot pursuit. They made their way to the courtyard to find the two small carriages already waiting. Janna and her boys in one and the other for Kevin's family. He looked to see his uncle Gerion trying to get Joy to join her aunt. But the girl seemed much more keen to ride along with Jon once she saw Winter was saddled. My lords, Jon said, rushing over to his horse. Tyrion joined his aunt in the first carriage, while Jaime and Loras mounted up. The gates opened, and they began their journey to the Red Keep itself. He resisted the urge to stick his head out the window and instead toaxed to his aunt and cousins. Finally, they reached the Red Keep, and Tyrion eagerly got out of the carriage. The castle itself looked even more imposing than it had in Tyrion's books. The red stone making it stand out as if it was on fire, and the drum towers rising high. To Tyrion, though, it wasn't as impressive as Casterly Rock, but he was happy to see it all the same. They were met by some gold cloaks, household guards, and Captain Vylar, who Tyrion noticed was deep in conversation with Jaime. Shall we, nephew? Jane said as Tywin and Walder rushed over to join their cousins and Jon. If we must, Tyrion said with a smile. It seems we must indeed, Jane said, and Tyrion turned to see his brother standing behind him with a smirk on his face. As they walked through the castle, Tyrion was disappointed to see no sign whatsoever of the Targaryens who built it. All evidence they had existed had been removed or covered over, and Tyrion, who had secretly hoped to see a dragon skull, felt the replacing stag banners and paintings didn't have the same impact. When they reached the large double doors, the guards outside allowed them to enter. The room itself was incredibly impressive, large and imposing, and there at the front sat the king on the Iron Throne itself, the throne looking much more impressive than the man who sat on it. Tyrion thought, "Lord Jaime Lannister, the Lord of Casterly Rock and the Warden of the West," the herald's voice boomed. "Lord Cavan Lannister, the Lord of Lannisport and First Admiral of the Western Fleet. Lord Jaime Lannister, the Lord of Castamere. Lord Tyrion Lannister, the heir to Casterly Rock. Lady Jenna Lannister, the Lady of Casterly Rock." Tyrion smiled at the last one. Jaime naming his aunt the Lady of the Rock would no doubt raise some eyebrows, but, as his brother said, with neither of them married, and since she took on the duties, she may as well have the title. "Your Grace," Jaime said as he bowed before the king. The rest of their retinue doing the same. "Your Grace," his brother then said, looking directly at their sister, whose smile belied the monster that lay beneath it. "Lord Jaime, welcome to the Red Keep," the king said, and Tyrion thought his words slurred. Was he already drunk? "Indeed. It's good to see you, Lord Yaxley," Cersei said, and Tyrion gulped as he saw the way she looked at his brother. Tyrion stood as the rest of the introductions were made. He noticed the smile the king gave his uncle Geryon and the grimace Cersei gave him. His uncle and aunt were welcomed both equally well by the king and queen, but when the king saw Jon and Loras was when things got interesting. "Jon Snow, come forward, your king wishes to see you. You can leave the flower behind." He japed, and Tyrion saw Jon's face crease, while Loras, to his credit, just nodded. "Your Grace," Jon said, getting down on one knee. "That lad, let me look at you. You've grown, my boy. A fine lad you've grown into. Isn't that right, Jon?" "Aye, that he has, your Grace." Jon Arryn said while standing to the king's left. "You'll be competing in the duels, won't you, my boy?" the king asked. "With your Grace's leave, I'd like to," Jon replied. "My leave, I insist. You show them just like you did in Lannisport. I'm afraid your father hasn't come, my boy, but never mind. You'll be cheered on by a king." Robert said, his smile beaming, "Then I shall surely prevail, your Grace." Jon replied, and the king laughed loudly. "That's the spirit, lad." The back and forth continued for a few more moments, Robert basically ignoring everyone else while lost in conversation with Jon, speaking of battles and tourneys and how much like his father he looked. Tyrion could see that Jaime was watching the king intently, his hands opening and closing by his sides. Eventually Jon Arryn coughed, and the king realized just how long he'd been speaking to Jon Snow, and how that may look, so he brought their conversation to an end. "You'll be coming to the feast, won't you, lad?" Robert asked. "I'd be honored, your Grace." "A piss on that, lad. At least with you there, I'll have someone to talk to." Robert said, his voice growing a little quieter at the end. "Well, let's move this along. I've rosies and fishes to meet," Robert said, laughing loudly. "Jon." The meeting with the king was harder than he had expected, the king still seeing him as Ned Stark's son, and because of it singling him out, even insulting Loras to do so. He had spoken as well as he could, but was glad they'd left the throne room. Just standing there brought up feelings he wasn't ready to face just yet. It was there in front of the throne that his brother and sister's bodies were presented to the impostor who sat where his father should now be sitting. There in that very room that man had looked down at the mutilated bodies of his family. A babe and a girl of 3 named days and loudly proclaimed that he saw no babes, only dragon spawn. As he stood there looking at the man, Jon had felt the rage rise inside him. Had he carried a weapon, he'd have buried it in the fat king's laughing face. It was only the sight of Ser Barristan which held his anger in check. All through the king's platitudes, the older knight had stared at him, offered him a reassuring smile, and Jon had managed to keep calm and bear through it all, far better than he would have had Barristan not been there. When they'd left the throne room, they made their way out of the castle, and there they'd split up. Jaime bringing Jon and Loras with them for a surprise, while the rest had made their way back to the manse, much to Joy's annoyance. It was only after he promised her a present, and after Geryon had took her on his horse, that Joy had agreed to go without him. He waved at her, and they were joined by Jorahs and Aulers, while Ghost appeared before rushing off in front of them, scaring people as he went. "So, my lord, what's the surprise?" Loras asked as they walked. "If I told you then it wouldn't be a surprise, now would it?" Jaime said, and Jon smirked. "What are you laughing at? You want to know as much as I do?" Loras grumbled. "Hi, I do, but I know better. It's a surprise, you idiot." Jon said and bumped Loras in the shoulder. "Will you come visit my family with me afterwards, Jon?" Lorzy asked. I don't know. Don't you want to see them on your own? Not really. Besides, if you come, we may get to spar while we're there, Loras said. You can go with Loras, Jon. I have a few things I need to take care of, so I won't need either of you the rest of the day. Just make sure you're back for Joy's story. I'm not explaining to her where you are, Jaime said, with a small laugh. Walking through King's Landing, he couldn't help but see how badly designed the place was. Be it the smell, the closeness of the houses together, it seemed like the whole place had just went up with no thought whatsoever. When they came to a turning which led to a really run-down part of town, Jon shuddered to see the children begging in the street. He cursed himself for not bringing coin with him and vowed to return at some point and make amends. They crossed a place Jaime named as Fishmonger Square, and continued on until finally entering the Street of Steel. Seeing where they were got both boys excited. As they walked, they could see large pieces of armor in the window, could hear the sounds of the hammers hitting anvils. They walked to the top of the street and came to a building that was much larger than all the others. They entered and were immediately met by a young man who asked their business before rushing to the back. My lord, a pleasure to have you visit my shop. The large bald man wearing an apron said as he walked into the room. Tobo, I trust you've finished the items I've ordered, Jaime said. Aye, of course, my lord. Some of my best work, Gendry. Bring Lord Jaime's order out, Tobo shouted to the back. I'll be needing some more armor also. My usual should suffice, plus a number of shields. I'm sure that won't be a problem, Jaime said, and the man nodded enthusiastically. After a few moments, a boy of around Jon's age came out. Though he was a lot larger than Jon, the boy had dark hair and bright blue eyes, and looked at them with an almost angry look, though it softened when Jon smiled. You is Master Tobo, Gendry said, handing the blacksmith 2 swords in scabbards. Good lad, Tobo said, and the boy smiled at the older man. I made simple scabbards, my lord, although should you wish I can make them more fancy like the swords themselves. No, that's fine, Jaime said, taking the first sword out. The sword was a smaller version of a longsword, perhaps made for someone not fully grown. Jon thought and was proved correct when Jaime turned to Loras. It's time you were both armed. You're skilled enough for it. Lorziers, this is for you, Jaime said, handing Loras the sword. Jon looked on as his friend's eyes widened. Loras took the sword almost reverently and examined it carefully. He had to admit it was an incredible-looking thing. The blade itself was far better made than most Jon had seen, and certainly of a quality he'd not seen on any sword other than Yami's or the 2 Valyrian swords he'd seen, Dark Sister and Ice. The hilt was a smooth, dark leather, while the guard was curved in what to Jon looked like thorns, the pommel, a golden stone shaped like a rose. He smiled as he saw the emotion on Loras' face, before turning to see his own sword being handed to him. This sword was a smaller, thinner blade, a copy both of his training sword and Dark Sister. As he held it, he marveled at its lightness, making even the training sword feel heavy in comparison. His sword's hilt was a smooth black leather, the pommel a white wolf's head with 2 red stones serving as the eyes. The guard was curved downward in the shape of a wolf's claw, and Jon could see the care that had gone in the making of the sword. I thank you, my lord, Master Tobo, Jon said with a large smile. As do I, Loras added, finally coming out of the daze he'd been in since he'd received the sword. You're welcome, my lord, Tobo said, and Jon didn't feel the urge to correct him. Now, lads, these are no training swords. You're to be careful with them. If you abuse the trust I'm showing, then I'll have no problem taking them back, Jaime said, and both he and Loras nodded understandingly. They strapped their new swords to their sides, he and Loras both happy to see how well they fit. As they left the shop, Jon looked around to see where Ghost had gotten to, only to hear a commotion from down the street. The wolf soon came running up, followed by an angry-looking man who was waving a large stick about. As he arrived at where Jon was standing, he saw the reason for the man's anger hanging from Ghost's mouth. The roll of blood sausage had perhaps at one point been quite large, but as Ghost sat in front of him, Jon watched it disappear into the hungry wolf's mouth. My lord, Jon said to a clearly amused Jaime, who threw him a couple of gold dragons. There he is! Grab him, thief, the large man said as he reached them. I'm sorry about him. Perhaps this would suffice, Jon said, throwing the man a gold dragon. He could see the man wasn't satisfied, so threw the other one. Just keep the damn beast away from my store, the man said, turning and walking away. Really? Jon said, looking to the wolf who was licking his lips, the blood sausage gone now. Ghost just cocked his head and looked him in the eye. Jon could swear the wolf was saying, "What's the problem? I caught it so I ate it. Pesky two-foots and their silly rules." He turned to see both lords and his guards were laughing loudly. Jaime, too, was smiling, so he turned back to Ghost and smirked. "Come on, you big furball. How about a nice chicken?" Jon said as the wolf jumped up and wagged his tail. They walked back through the streets, stopping off so Jon could buy Ghost the chicken he'd promised him, the wolf eagerly eating it down before running off to do God knows what. After walking for what felt like an age, they arrived back at the castle, Ghost turning up just as they did. The guards weren't keen on letting them enter, but Jon was surprised to see Sir Barristan walk over to them and speak on their behalf. "My thanks, sir," Jon said with a smile. "Don't mention it, lad," Barristan said and looked at Jon intently. Jon nodded and turned to Jaime, who seemed to understand. "Sir Barristan, come let's speak of Torny's past and former brothers." Jaime said, "Aye, let's do that, Lord Jaime, Lorisier, Jon. I bid you both a good day," Barristan said as he and Jaime walked away. Jon could see how Loras was looking at the two men as they walked away, the look of wonder on his face. The two greatest knights in the Seven Kingdoms off to speak of past adventures, what either of them would give to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. "Come, Jon. I'm sure if I keep my grandmother waiting much longer, she'll skin me alive." "I didn't know your grandmother was a Bolton," Loras, Jon jabbed. "Oh, Jon, poor Jon. You have no idea. My grandmother makes the Boltons seem like mummers." Lorza said, his smirk curling up, and Jon gulped. "Come, Ghost, you'll protect me, right?" Jon said, and the wolf nodded. Sir Barristan, standing in the throne room while Robert spoke to his king, had been torture. He could see the boy was holding something in. Did he know? Had Jaime told him? He wondered. As he looked to Jon, he felt he did. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there when he met him at the tourney. A determination, a focus he hadn't had before. As he watched him look at the king, he could see hatred in his eyes. He had done his best with smiles and looking reassuringly at him to try calm him down, and he was glad it seemed to work. The boy stayed polite and friendly, and the king was overjoyed to speak to him. After what felt like an age, they left, and Barristan was happy. His shift was ending. He made his way back to White Sword Tower and cleaned up before heading out for the day, hoping to bump into Jaime so they could speak, and if he had Jon with him, then so much the better.